I'm calling this the Beatles Phenomenon because that's what the Beatles were, really, a phenomenon. And looking back after all these years, I'm just wondering how good the music was, really. So, at the time, it was groundbreaking and it's very special. It seemed to be something new, something that had never been seen or heard before. How about the modern generation? What do they think about the Beatles? I think the older people who remember the scale of the Beatles' fame might be surprised at the fact that a lot of younger people really don't rate the Beatles right now anymore. I think there's no doubt that the Beatles were a phenomenon and that what they did at the time was very original. And it's amazing it lasted, what they did lasted so long, but maybe it's normal for what they did to be replaced by other things after 50, 60 years. So how much of it will actually continue to be important to music listeners in the future? That's a good question, I think. Let me say that personally I like the early Beatles more than the later Beatles. I think the early Beatles was early rock and roll, and early rock and roll was kind of influenced by all sorts of things, ballad making, Broadway shows, so on and so forth. It was a mixed bag which you could call rock and roll, but it was a bit of everything, really. And it was a bit of Elvis Presley, it was a bit of Buddy Holly, it was a bit of Ricky Valens, it was a bit of all those early rock and roll heroes, and what they did was very eclectic, and it was fine, really, to sing a ballad and call it rock and roll. Things began to change later on, partly through what the Beatles did themselves, and also what other bands like the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin did. Began to be more blues oriented, and the rock became harder rock. Totally different, really, to the Beatles. In the later stages of their career, you felt they were trying too hard to be rockers. I'm not sure they ever were, really. Essentially, they were an early rock and roll band that was better than any of the others, and came up with some great melodies, songs, short songs of about two and a half minutes most of the time. Let me go through some of my own favorites. Well, from the early days, McCartney's P.S. I Love You, I think, was a great melody, and again, typical of early rock and roll, where it could just revert to a kind of show-type ballad. I also liked We Can Work It Out by McCartney and Paperback Writer. I think the melodies were very inventive, and that's what he was really good at, thinking of inventive melodies. The stuff they did together was great for the time. Can't Buy Me Love, I want to Hold Your Hand, Twist and Shout, all that stuff. Great early rock and roll. Based on or having a lot in common with Buddy Holly, Elvis Presley, all of these early rock and roll groups, Chuck Berry. And John Lennon was much the same, really. He came up with the melodies and the lyrics to some great songs. In My Life, and as time went by, Norwegian Wood, moving on into some great songs on the White Album, like Dear Prudence, which is one of my favourites. I think the change began to happen when McCartney started trying to become a rocker. Maybe John Lennon did a little bit as well. Maybe he was genuinely more of a rocker than Paul anyway, but stuff which really wasn't very inspired, which, because it was the Beatles, was just automatically went to number one and everyone said was great. Maybe there hadn't been much like that before, but to me, songs like Hey Jude or Get Back, they're not eternal classics, they're just signs of decline. Paul McCartney and the Beatles trying to be out and out rockers when they were really a little early rock and roll band that was well suited to that short period between about 1960, 61 and 1965, 1966. The decline started to come seriously with Sgt. Pepper, in my opinion. I still find it hard to listen to. It's just, it has inventive tunes and it's influential, yes, and giving carte blanche to future acts to kind of do what they want and create concept albums. I think Roger Waters of Pink Floyd has said that he listened to it in his car and he thought it was mind-blowing in the sense that it gave everybody the new options to do what they wanted in the future. But as music, really, Polythene, is it Polythene Mean Mr. Mustard or Polythene Pam? Perhaps I'm getting them mixed up with a White Album, I might, but in any case, even A Day in the Life or Fixing a Hole, I Get By with a little help from my friends. She's Leaving Home is a nice ballad, but it's like a reversion back to what the Beatles had been a few years earlier, with the help of new technological, I couldn't say gadgets, but just really the question of George Martin putting a full string quartet on it and all the rest of the effects. But there's nothing new really, and it's a nice melody. Like Yesterday's a nice melody. But yeah, it's a kind of throwback. The new things are the hard rockers, and for me they don't really cut it. Sgt. Pepper, the title track, is a real bore for me, and the only really good song on it is the experimental Good Morning by John Lennon, which I always found interesting. Going to school, don't want to go, feeling low down, boom. But other than that, I think most of it is very forgettable. If it wasn't the Beatles, I doubt we'd be listening to those songs now. Guys of that generation will, and gals, but particularly guys maybe, will tell you how great these songs are. Oh, I'm fixing a hole. Oh, I get by with a little help from my friends. But to me, it's all really corny. You go back to the earlier Beatles with their earliest albums, probably right up to Revolver, through Beatles for Sale, Rubber Soul, and even Revolver. Now this is the real development of a rock and roll group to something else, something special. And yeah, I think Revolver is a real culmination. After that, it was all just bits and pieces. The Beatles trying to prove themselves as hard rockers and doing it very badly for most of the time. They certainly couldn't hold a candle to groups like the Stones or Led Zeppelin as hard rockers. Just kind of light pop rock, and there's no chance, I think, that any of this stuff from um, from Sergeant Pepper onwards will be remembered very fondly, although there are exceptions, of course, because they were fine songwriters. Dear Prudence is an exception. Something is an exception. Even Back in the USSR is a good song. However, stuff like Obla-Di Obla-Dar or Rocky Raccoon and Maxwell's Silver Hammer and all that kind of crap is just a sign of terrible decline, really. What they did that was good from Sergeant Pepper onwards was always just harking back to what they had done well at earlier times. There was really nothing special about it at all. Abbey Road is a nice album. George Harrison seemed to be producing the best music at that time. Paul and John Lennon kind of worked out the theme of music in them, of a rocking nature. So it was just about the right time for them to split up. Probably they should have done it a few years earlier. Let It Be is a terrible album. So my basic thesis is that the Beatles were an early rock and roll band that were better than any other rock and roll band around at the time. They took their inspiration from the early rockers like Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly, Chuck Berry, and they were really tight. And as long as they could perform their songs live, they were really interesting. But as soon as they stopped touring and went into the recording studio and gave George Martin his head, it all became very boring and predictable, although because they were the Beatles and it had such a phenomenal cultural effect on society by that time, everybody just kept buying their music anyway. But it really had declined and wasn't anything like as good as earlier on, because the Beatles were not really a rock band. They were an early rock and roll band. As I said before, that included ballads that would not seem out of place in a show. For example, Eleanor Rigby, Yesterday, In My Life, P.S. I Love You, songs like this. They were experimenting around with new sounds. George Harrison with the sitar, great on Norwegian Wood. We Can Work It Out, great melody, as I said before. But then they started to believe their own publicity and thought, oh yeah, we can do whatever we want and everybody will love it. Well, whatever we do, it's a masterpiece. And really, I can't stand hearing Get Back or Hey Jude, which goes on interminably, without wanting to puke, really. So I think this will not last. This latter part of the music will not last, and it will be the early music up to and including Revolver that the fame is based on. And it's a considerable fame, and I don't think people will forget the great early songs or the cultural impact that they had. After they split up, McCartney's decline in particular became very apparent, with enormous amounts of rubbish being produced by this man. He did do a few good things, as you would expect for somebody who clearly had his ability, but the amazing thing was that there was so little of it. I think that Band on the Run is a great song, and it's a good album too. Not everything is great on that album. Jet is a good song. There are one or two other good songs on the album. But yeah, Band on the Run is a great song, and that's a good album too. Coming Up was a good song. John Lennon liked it too. And along the way, he has made one or two good songs, of course. You would expect that of somebody with his talent. But as I say, the amazing thing is that it's been so little. And he still keeps churning them out now as well. What is he, nearly 80? You know, he should give it a rest and just rest on his laurels, I think, now. John Lennon, much better as a solo artist than Paul McCartney, because he wasn't just this facile melody guy. He had ideas, and he could make a good melody, but he also could write good pointed lyrics. And his first album, Imagine, after the split of the Beatles, was a great one, with many fine songs. Jealous Guy, Crippled Inside, Imagine, of course, which is, I must admit, is not one of my favourite songs by John Lennon, but I can see it's a very fine song anyhow. And then after that, the development continued of John Lennon producing music which was much more interesting as a solo artist than Paul McCartney did, and that was the same up until the point that Lennon was shot and killed. George Harrison, well, I don't know. Yeah, he probably ties with McCartney for his post-Beatles work. There wasn't as much of it, and that's probably a good thing. Some of it was very good. Again, mostly the early work. All Things Must Pass. Fine song, fine album. A bit like McCartney, his later material was not so interesting, really. Ringo was just Ringo, so yeah, he's just a guy who got lucky and banged the drums for the Beatles. So my final point of view about this is that the Beatles were a phenomenon of rock and roll, the early days of rock and roll, and although what they did may have led into later rock music and harder rock, they couldn't do that themselves, and their attempts at it were pretty poor and pretty boring, and they would have been better if they had disbanded probably 2 or 3 years earlier than they did, probably around the time of Sgt. Pepper, in fact, which is a ridiculous concept in my opinion. There's no real concept there at all. It's just Paul McCartney and the other guys putting on silly costumes and saying that, oh yeah, it's all about traveling music group and circus, Sgt. Pepper, and they all sing different kinds of songs. So whatever songs we come up with, just put them under the Sgt. Pepper umbrella. Yeah, When I'm 64 is not a bad song from that album, but again, whenever I hear it now, I kind of hear it with the remembrance of what was coming, or the knowledge of what was coming later from McCartney with Maxwell's Silver Hammer, Oh Bloody, Oh Bloodar, and all the rest of that rubbish. And you can see elements of it in When I'm 64 too. So although it's quite a nice song in itself, it's also looking forward to songs I hate. So this is not entirely a positive review of the Beatles, I don't suppose, and it might be different to the point of view of the majority of people, but I'm sure that a lot of listeners will agree with me and see that Beatles actually reached their peak with Revolver, or at least in terms of development of musical ideas. Although in my opinion, even Revolver was not as good as, say, Beatles for Sale or Rubber Soul, because the Beatles were essentially an early rock and roll band, and that's what they did best, and they did it best of all at the beginning of their careers, not at the end after fame had made them soft. They had massaged their egos into thinking that whatever they did was untouchable and a masterpiece, which certainly isn't true. So yeah, that's my view of the Beatles, and if anybody thinks something different, I'd be glad to hear from them in the comments section.